The bulk of free agency is behind us, and while there are still some moves left to make, the pre-draft direction for most of the NFL has been set. The Athletic's Robert Mays is in the lounge to discuss which front offices are doing it right, how to maximize your cap space, and the Seahawks direction in the wake of a very busy couple of weeks. Let's light them up.
I'm Jacson Bevins, and this is Cigar Thoughts.
Welcome back to the Cigar Lounge. I am Jacson Bevins, and along with my obsequious producer, Mike Barwin, this is the Cigar Thoughts podcast. And I have been looking forward to chatting with Robert for a long time, and I think you guys will really appreciate his perspective. But first, cigars and whiskey. Cigar Thoughts is proud to be partnered with Seattle Cigar Concierge and Belveni single malt Scotch whiskey. Seattle Cigar Concierge and I have teamed up to release 2 versions of high-quality Cigar Thoughts stogies, both of which you can purchase by following the link on the show page or by visiting cigarthoughtsnfl.com. Mike and I love doing the show, and there are 2 ways y'all listening and watching can help support it so that we can keep the episodes coming. One is by purchasing the cigars, and the other is by subscribing to our YouTube channel at Cigar Thoughts, where you can watch full episodes as well as the funny and insightful clips that Mike puts together. Give a thumbs up to the stuff you like and let us know what you think in the comments. And of course, you can listen to us everywhere you get your podcasts. It's easy as a sports fan to get a little myopic about your team. Sometimes it's because of natural affinity, sometimes it's simply a bandwidth issue, and sometimes it's because, well, fuck those other teams, you know? But here, we're striving to elevate the discussion, and doing so requires context. We also know that the effort required to have a firm grasp on what every team in the NFL is doing, especially during the chaos of free agency, takes a ton of effort. That's why I'm stoked to be joined by one of the preeminent writers, podcasters, and analysts covering the league over the last decade. Forged in the fires at Grantland and The Ringer, he now writes about the NFL for The Athletic and hosts the Athletic Football Show with another friend of the pod, Derek Klassen. He is Robert Mays. Robert, thanks for coming in, man.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. I appreciate you asking me.
Yeah, man. I've been, like I said at the top of the show, this is a conversation I'm looking forward to for a long time. And I think this is the perfect time of year to chat with someone like yourself, because there are so many things happening. And some of the biggest moves that happen this time of year, in fact, I would say often the most impactful moves that happen this time of year aren't the headline makers. They're not the ones leading first take. It's the under the radar signings. It's the cap manipulation that sets teams up for success and failure. And you and Derek do such an incredible job on your show of breaking all of that down and having just a really good sense of what these moves do in the greater context. So I want to start there and ask you who you think the best front offices in the NFL are right now and why.
It's a really good question. And I feel like it's different answers for different reasons, but I always have just appreciated what the Eagles have done. And for me, and obviously the reason I say it's a different answer for a different reason is that different front offices are equipped in different ways, right? So the Eagles are able to overcome mistakes in ways that some other teams might not because of how much cash they've been willing to throw around over the last few years. If another team's big free agent splash, along with Saquon Barkley, was Bryce Huff, and Bryce Huff didn't play for that team the entire season, it would be the only thing we talked about in reference to that team. Sure. And for the Eagles, they're able to overcome those things because of how their front office is allowed to operate and how they're willing to spend. So there's just more wiggle room and there's more margin for error than there is in some other places. But I really respect how proactive they are, how many different places they look for solutions, and how creative they are in solving some of their problems, even if they are dealing with a weighted deck in some ways. And then the other teams, I've always appreciated what the Ravens have done. I think that there's a methodical approach to how they do things. There's always going to be, if you open Tankathon and you click on the Baltimore logo, there's going to be draft picks that they just found in the walls every single year. And I think that as tempting as it is to look at teams that are overly aggressive and teams that make these big splashy moves, over time, I think we found that the best way to be successful in the draft is just to have the most draft picks. And so teams that are willing to be steadfast in that approach, I think ultimately do get rewarded when they operate that way. And then there are other teams, that maybe don't necessarily get as much credit because we don't hold them in that sort of esteem for one reason or another. But like a front office that I've become really impressed with and just have gotten a lot of respect for over the last several years is like what the Bucs have been able to do. Like their ability to kind of move on and pivot after Brady and stay competitive and create a culture and a building that guys are willing to stay for a little bit less money, and just how they've been able to keep that roster together, the way that they've been able to kind of find these little pivot points, like their ability multiple different times over the last 5 or so years to build really good offensive lines with different groups of people. That's really hard. Like if you look at the Eagles, they've kind of been able to do that, but Lane Johnson's been there the whole time. Jason Kelce was there for most of it. Jordan Mailata's been there for a long time. It's one or two pieces that kind of shift around. For the Bucs, I mean, that entire line, other than Tristan Wirfs, is different than it was when they won the Super Bowl, but they're still a really good unit playing at a high level. So I think there are different teams that just do different things that I appreciate, and I'm not sure how we would necessarily stack them up because they're coming at it from slightly different places.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. All 32 NFL teams are fighting the same war, but they're doing it from different places on the terrain. And you cannot take the same strategy in the valley that you do if you're up on the mountaintop, right? Those are two different fighting styles. And I think the best front offices are the ones who understand themselves the best, and not just understand how they operate so that they can be consistent in doing that year over year, but also having an honest understanding of where their team is on the contention spectrum.
Yeah.
And not making a win now move when you're more than one piece away, or not being afraid to capitalize and push your chips in when you are there close. It's defining how far away from being a final 8 team, which is how I determine whether your team is good enough, is if you make it to the final 8, then you've got a chance to win the Super Bowl. Like you just can do it at that point. And so that's why just making the playoffs oftentimes doesn't feel good enough for most teams. And so, one of the things that really stood out about the 3 teams that you mentioned is on draft day, it never feels like they are drafting for need or reaching for players or anything. They let everybody else do that and then just take the best guy that's there for them, especially early in the draft. I think drafting for need late day 2, early day 3, on throughout the draft, that's fine. You gotta plug your holes and take some shots. But those high leverage picks, I really respect when teams say, you know what, we kind of already have a guy here, but this is the best football player left. Let's put him on the team.
I appreciate several different things that you just said. One, understanding your roster and understanding what the vision is moving forward, not just for this year, but the multi-year vision, is hugely important. I mean, we see so many mistakes get made in the NFL because teams misjudge and misunderstand the talent on their own roster. And I think that ultimately ends up with a lot of mistakes. And I think, like you said, understanding where you are in your build and understanding what the multi-year outlook looks like, where you're making sure, we're drafting guys like Cam Jurgens is a great example, right? Like Cam Jurgens was sat on the bench for multiple years, or 1 year at center and then played guard for a year before stepping in for Jason Kelce. But that was always the succession plan for that. There are always guys in the pipeline at some of these positions to create depth for a lot of these teams that do it well. And so that to me is the most important thing. Understanding the vision for your team and having that vision be on a multi-year level. A team I would throw out that I didn't mention before that I think kind of fits this is like what the Lions have done. Right? Like the Lions have such a strong understanding of what types of players they want in the building. And I think that they've stylistically gone after those guys. You can feel how they want to play based on the players that they acquire. And then something else they do that I find just really notable and impressive is they'll kind of volume shoot when they feel like they need to address a certain position. So last year it wasn't, we're going to trade for Carlton Davis and then we're going to be good. No. It was, we're going to trade for Carlton Davis. We're going to draft Terrion Arnold. We're going to draft Enos Rakestraw. We're going to sign Amik Robertson. By the end of this, even if there's some attrition, and they Unfortunately for them, it wasn't how it worked out. But the mindset is, even if there is some attrition, we're still going to be okay at this position. So just being a little bit more aggressive sometimes than you have to be, but not aggressive in the amount of resources that you're spending, aggressive in the amount of bodies that you're throwing at a problem. I also respect teams that are able to do it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's just some GMs, some front offices that seem to have a knack for getting the right players. And as frustrating as it is as a Seahawks fan, Les Snead appears to be one of those guys who can pivot in a hurry when he loses. He had that stretch, the fuck them picks stretch that won a Super Bowl, where it's like, you know what? We're not going to take the salary cap advantages of, hoping that these rookies become stars. We're just going to go get stars. And then as they started to age out of that, they have been able to pivot. They found a Puka Nacua, a Jared Verse, a Brandon Fisk. And I'm just scratching the surface, right? Those are the bigger names. Kyron Williams, in the aftermath of Todd Gurley, their ability to go from Jared Goff to Matthew Stafford. They've had success both ways, and I find that really impressive as well.
Absolutely. And they're another one of those teams. The Jonah Jackson signing just doesn't matter because they found Bo Limmer in the 6th round. So we just don't talk about it. And I think you need, when you're going to be that sort of team and those mistakes are going to matter less, you need certain multipliers in your favor. For the Eagles, I think they are creative and they do structure things in a certain way. But again, the money they can spend is a multiplier in their favor. For the Rams, I think that McVay is kind of a multiplier in their favor. It gives you a little bit more wiggle room when you have somebody like that at the core of it. The Niners are the exact same way. The fact that the Niners missed on Trey Lance and then made multiple NFC championship games and went to a Super Bowl after doing that, how many teams could do that? And it's possible because you have somebody like Shanahan to be that multiplier for a Brock Purdy. And the Rams, you look at some of the things that they've done, and that first version you were talking about when it was the fuck them picks era, it's fun when the fuck them picks era leads to Jalen Ramsey. It's less fun when it's Jamal Adams, right? And so it's not just that level of aggression.
You're absolutely right. You
need to pick the right guys when you're making those sorts of swings. And so
100%.
They happen to find the right guys when they were showing that level of aggression. The Von Miller thing is the same way. So you look at Von Miller, they trade for Von Miller midseason. They give up multiple picks to go get Von Miller. He has a great back half of that year. They win the Super Bowl. The Bills, who I think were, before the Von Miller trade from the Rams, were probably in a slightly similar position, right? We think we're close. What do we need for that shot in the arm to finally get us over the top? We've been patient. We've been responsible. How do we get that injection that ultimately leads to us winning a championship? They signed Von Miller to a huge contract, and it ends up becoming a disaster. So sometimes you need to hit at the right moment because something you could do would look great, and then another team does something that's analogous to it, and it's not quite the right moment, and it comes back to bite them in a way it didn't come back to bite you.
Yeah, and I think, I made the analogy earlier about fighting a war from different vantage points, and if I can torture it a little bit further, it's landscape that shifts also. And just because it's advantageous to be where you are in 2021 doesn't mean it's going to be the most advantageous place to be in 2023. And so, and on it goes, right? And then you see a new system come through and change the way football is played at the highest level. And so you start to get copycats, and then you start to get counterattacks that didn't used to exist. We know this here in Seattle very well. John Schneider and Pete Carroll, whatever you think of the last 10 years, their first 3 years were immaculate when it came to roster construction, because they identified something in the NFL, a trend in the NFL of teams getting smaller and faster. And they were willing to break molds at certain positions to say, we're just going to kick the shit out of you at every position. And they did. And then teams, there was no schematic advantage. Pete Carroll was borderline arrogant in the fact that he was just saying, hey, look, we're not going to deceive you. We're just going to line up and out execute you. We're just going to be better football players than you. And then once those players age out or their contracts get more expensive, it gets a little bit tougher to just line up and beat somebody. But you also saw The first team that I saw crack the LOB was Phillip Rivers' Chargers. And it was after, I believe it was early 2015 season after early 2014 season after they won the Super Bowl. And he completed like 42 passes against them in a game. And it was like 108 degrees on the field. And he just carved them apart. And it showed, okay, you can't test this team deep. If you're patient enough to just take paper cut after paper cut, you can beat this team. And then what did Tom Brady do in the Super Bowl that year? And then Seattle never really quite got back. Right now, we are seeing the Eagles go back to just winning in the trenches. Like, we're just going to do dad football better than you. And they did it. And it wasn't even boring. It was like wildly entertaining. And so now, every NFL fan is like, well, you know what we got to do? We got to beef up the trenches this offseason. And it's like, yeah, it's far easier said than done because there's like 26 shitty offensive lines out there. And the guys that make it to free agency are the ones that those shitty free offensive lines didn't think were worth the money. So it's challenging to do that. But I ask you this because you led with the Eagles in terms of your favorite front offices. And yes, Howie Roseman is my GM of choice also, was before they even won the Super Bowl. Do you think the best strategy for other teams is to try and replicate that or to try and counterpunch?
It's a great question. And when you were talking about the Seahawks and just that Legion of Boom era and kind of what comes next, and even thinking about the Rams and kind of how they've changed, it's all cyclical, right? Like, it's all going to come back around. And so I think the key is, how much further ahead are you in the cycle than everybody else? Are you a step ahead? Are you 2 steps ahead? And I think if you can do that, if you're nimble enough to make sure you're always keeping just a little bit of room between you and everybody else, that's the goal. And so, yeah, we can say the Eagles built through the trenches and that's how they did this. Well, the Eagles spent their first 2 picks in last year's draft on 2 defensive backs, and then they signed a running back to a top of market deal in free agency when you're not supposed to do that.
That's right.
And so it's easy to say, well, we'll just build through the trenches again. Well, the Eagles got over the top by doing different things. And also, the Eagles have A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. Like, they have 2 receivers they spent first-round picks on. So it's just good to be good everywhere, I think, is the lesson I learned from the Eagles more than anything else. But when I look at, you mentioned the Pete Carroll and you mentioned kind of, all right, they never kind of refound their footing. I think that nimbleness and your ability to react to what other teams are doing to you is ultimately how you sustain success. And I don't think that the Seahawks should be criticized for not trying to do that. I think people are going to look back at the broad swaths of the Pete Carroll era and say, oh, they just never evolved defensively, and that's why they struggled to kind of figure things out on the back end. Well, that's not true. They tried multiple different times to evolve. They tried to tap into multiple different defensive systems and ideas, and you roll Carl Scott through there, and you roll Sean Desai through there, and you're trying to change, and you're trying to keep up with the times. But how cleanly you're able to do that and how nimble you are in those pivot points, I think becomes huge. And the Rams' ability to consistently tweak who they are on offense to, again, kind of stay a half step ahead of everybody else, that's something that's something the Seahawks weren't able to do on defense. And I think that's why, throw age out, why Sean McVay is still a top 5 head coach and why Pete Carroll was on his second team, in just a few years.
Yep. No, I think that's fair. And I want to come back to something you said that I really liked about their franchises. In order to like really capitalize on the game plan that you're putting into place from a front office standpoint, is you need force multipliers outside of that front office. That can be your coaching, which I am fond of saying on this show, I think is the biggest market inefficiency in the NFL. And if I was an owner, instead of throwing $40 million guaranteed at a free agent guard, I'd be like, how's $40 million for the best coaching staff? And then I'm like, why not just go poach? Spend $60 million on your coaching staff and have the best coaches everywhere, because that's what helps teams really maximize, obviously, the talent they have on hand. I think, obviously, having a great quarterback can be a big force multiplier too. But also, and this doesn't get talked about, and it brings us back to the Rams, is having an owner willing to cut checks and put 9 figures in escrow year after year after year. Because, and correct me if I get any part of this wrong, but my understanding is that when you guarantee money, the owner can't just be like, oh yeah, I'm good for it. They have to put the money into escrow so that the third party knows that money is going to get to the player. And not every owner is willing to do that.
I think that has changed a little bit just because there's so much cash with these teams where I don't think anyone struggles to keep up with the guarantees and the escrow stuff anymore. I think everyone has enough money to do that. You know, like a team like the Raiders, we used to talk about that being an issue. It's no longer an issue. Like the Raiders have gotten an injection of cash, but with both the move and some of the minority partners that they have, where I think these teams have enough cash to do that. To me, it's what levers are you willing to pull in the necessary moments to step outside of just the normal structures of the NFL, right? So there are some teams that even if they have cash on hand to sign these contracts, like what the Bengals just did, you look at the 2026 Bengals salary cap. I don't know the numbers offhand, but I want to say that Joe Burrow's cap hit is something like $45-ish million next year, 45 to 50. He has a $25 million base salary as a part of that entire calculation. One of the ways that it would be easier if you were the Bengals to spend around the T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, and potentially Trey Hendrickson contracts is by taking that Joe Burrow deal, who you know is going to be on the roster 5 years from now, and zeroing out that base salary and creating $20-ish million in cap space. There are teams around the NFL that do that. The Bills have consistently done that with Josh Allen's contract almost every single year. The Chiefs aren't always like that. They kind of pick and choose just because their budget is actually a little bit stricter than some of the other contenders tend to be. So one year they'll do it with Mahomes, one year they won't. But they've done it every so often. The Eagles pre-restructure their contracts. So if you look at the way that the Eagles contracts are set up, they don't zero out base salaries. The base salaries are already $1 million. They've already done that, and they do some of their work with like option bonuses and stuff. But what that allows you to do is the cap is just an accounting mechanism. So you can spend more money than the salary cap if you're willing to move that money around. I don't think the Bengals will be willing to do that for Joe Burrow. And so that will mean that the Joe Burrow, Chase, Higgins, and potentially Hendrickson contracts are huge impediments to spending on the rest of the roster. Look at the Eagles. They don't have to be. They don't have to be if you don't want them to be. And so that's why I think it's just important to acknowledge that these teams are coming at these problems from different places, and they have different resources to solve some of these problems.
Well, and it's such a great point. Like, we don't have holdout issues with the Eagles. Jalen Hurts, lock him up. A.J. Brown, lock him up. Devonta Smith, lock him up. Our O-line, lock those guys up. Saquon Barkley, 1 year into a 3-year contract. Let's just go ahead and make you the highest paid running back of all time. Let's just do it now. And I imagine there's a lot of players who really appreciate that. And it also gets them to free agency a year earlier. So there's benefits on both sides. And I'm so glad that you brought up the cap as essentially I think that we tend to think of the salary cap as the end all be all for how you structure a team. In reality, it is one factor in the equation, a major factor, maybe even the denominator, but it is only one factor of the equation. So my question to you is there an ideal amount of cap space to have? And the reason I ask this is I struggle with the idea that more is just more. Like, you want to have enough to be able to go out and improve your team and re-sign your best players and all of these things. But if you have too much, I look at the New England Patriots. You got $126 million in cap space. I mean, hang the banner, cap space champions 2025, right? But like, you got to spend it. And the point of cap space is to use it on good players. And I think that there is a segment of fans, and this is something that I have to check myself on too, that look at cap space and say, okay, clear it, get more. So my question to you is more cap space more valuable and stop, or is it more like a bell curve?
I was looking through, I have all these like weird stickies on my desktop that are just like scribbles of ideas. And I can't remember if it's on this sticky or it's actually something I wrote down by hand. But what is the ideal amount of cap space is literally something that I wrote down last week as something to explore as a show idea. And so the fact that you asked me this is great. And I get, so what I'll say is I think I want more time to actually dig into it, but I think it's a fascinating conversation.
Fair.
The answer is definitely not $160 million. That I'm comfortable saying right now, because that's a sign for two reasons. One, you can't spend $160 million in free agency. You can try, like you can try. They tried to do it with Milton Williams and Chris Godwin and all these guys that they were willing to overpay, but eventually there's going to be diminishing returns on that, even if the guys want to go there. And it's also a sign that you have no good players. If you have $160 million in cap space, that means you've drafted very poorly over the last 4 or 5 years. So it's definitely not that, and it's definitely not negative $50 million like the Saints are dealing with every single offseason. I think that I would say it's just maintaining the right amount of flexibility in any given year to pivot when you need to. You know, if there's a situation where there's a guy who's available via trade, you know, if you're the Buffalo Bills in 2020 and you want to trade for Stephon Diggs and he has an $18 million base salary, having the flexibility to do that is important. Right. But that flexibility is more important early in your build than it is later in your build when you've already committed to some of those guys. Mm-hmm. So I just think it's about, again, maintaining a multi-year plan and understanding when you're going to need to push and when you're going to throttle back. For the Eagles, they've spent so much in cash over the last few years. I think there was probably always going to be some sort of reckoning where they pulled back a little bit. Same with the Niners this year. You know, the Niners this year have been a little bit more conscious of their spending because, you know, they really did throw a lot of real money around over the last couple years. So I want to do some research on it to actually figure out what the right range is, because I do think it's a fascinating question. But my cop-out answer is it's enough where you have flexibility, but not so much where it's indication that you don't have enough good players on your team.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the honesty in the answer. Let's consider this an ongoing conversation, and I look forward to any conclusions you come to with it. We've talked high level NFL at large. Here's the things that have worked for teams. Here's the things that haven't. I want to bring it back down, bring it a little bit closer to home, and ask you, as you know, outside looking in, where you think John Schneider and the Seahawks front office falls within the spectrum of GMs throughout this league.
It's a great question. And I feel like with somebody like John Schneider, when they had so much success early on, but so much of that success was driven by the draft success that they had. And whenever you're having a conversation about how fickle this all feels and how random and luck-based some of it is, the Seahawks are the first team that you mentioned. Because you look at what happened from 2011, essentially, to like 2014, or even doesn't even, you don't have to go that far, but like the first couple years of the John Schneider, Pete Carroll era, let's say 2010 through 2012, even those first three drafts and the amount of players they came away with.
Dude, that's like the best AAV drafting stretch we'll ever see in our lives.
It was incredible. And so if that were a skill, right, then you would assume that those guys who did that were just continue to be able to do it. But we know that it's not really a skill. We know that there's going to be so much variance with it that eventually you're going to hit some of those fallow periods where you're not quite drafting as well. And I think if you look at what happened to the Seahawks during that period, they compounded that to a degree by the amount of trades that they were trying to make. And, you know, you can go back through and there's a ton of them, right? Sheldon Richardson, Percy Harvin, Jimmy Graham, all those guys. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. But I think trying to counteract your draft issues by saying, all right, well, we drafted LJ Collier. That was a mistake. Let's go trade for some other defensive lineman that'll help us. I think sometimes those issues can compound one another. And then you have fewer draft picks. And so that run of luck you want to have in the draft that you need again to course correct can't happen because you have fewer draft picks. And I think some of that is what's happened to the Seahawks. All of that being said, they've been successful. Like, they've been a moderately successful team for a very long time. And so I don't want to trash them necessarily, but I think that what they have fallen victim to me, is a very textbook by the book. This is what can happen when you start drafting not quite as well for a long stretch of time.
You know, it's funny, and I think that's a great insight. One of one of the best books I've read this year is called Same as Ever. It's by Morgan Housel. And he's basically, in this, he's looking for universal themes that are going to predict success or failure as much as we can across, all of the different multiverse options that are out there. And one of the things that he talks about is how success can breed complacency and how success can breed an overconfidence in your ability to perform relative to the median, right? Because if you do hit on a Cam Chancellor and a Richard Sherman and a Doug Baldwin late, when you get Bobby Wagner in the second round because he was sick for the combine and couldn't test, when Russell Wilson hits in the third round after you spent all this money on Matt Flynn, right? It's same thing. Brock Purdy covers all the sins of the Trey Lance trade. That you can start to say, okay, I've got this figured out. And I do wonder two things. I think from my perspective, one thing Schneider struggled with after that initial success was believing he could outsmart the draft, because that 2010 and 2012 drafts both received F grades from a lot of people, right? Like, why on earth are you doing this? And they ended up being Hall of Fame caliber draft classes. And that leads to LJ Collier and James Carpenter and Rashad Penny in first round picks, where it's like, okay, Seahawks are making their pick. You hear the music, you see the Goodell announcement, and then you're like flipping through your draft board to get to like page 4 to figure out where this guy is. I think there's that. And if I were to offer an excuse for John Schneider's draft struggles, I would say like 2013 through 2017 is that when you've built an Eagles-like roster, it's really hard to draft guys that can come in and earn playing time. When you're set everywhere, there's not jobs to win. And so it's tough for these guys. They come in, and I don't care who you draft, they're not going to outplay Earl Thomas, right? You're not drafting someone better than Michael Bennett. And so it's tough for that. And now they've been kind of trying to find their footing. We've danced around it. I would like an answer, best as you can. Where you think John Schneider, you don't have to give me like a number out of 32, but like maybe a tier that you think John Schneider and his front office fall into.
I would say probably somewhere like middle of the pack would be my guess. I would have to think a little bit more about it just to like really start to tier it out. But I think middle of the pack is probably what I would say. They've done a really good job of staying relevant for a long period of time. I think that, even something like this offseason, right? We could argue about whether we thought this was the right path or not. But I think this offseason honestly shows a little bit of humility when it comes to like, we could say we're close with Geno and we could say we're close with DK. Or we could say, let's get a few more bites at the apple here and reset a little bit because maybe we're not that close. I think some teams would see 10 wins last year and think we just need one or two more things to go our way and we'll be a Super Bowl contender. They didn't think that. And I honestly think that there's something admirable there, because I do think that some of the, not caution that they showed, but some of the just prudency that they showed in some of the moves that they made, where it's like, we're going to have a few more resources. We're going to do this at a little bit of a slower clip. I actually think that's okay. I actually think that's an okay way to approach it. I feel like that is an approach and a mindset and a way to go about this that other teams that build this thing in the right way would also do. So I think that the funny thing about John Schneider is two things. One, it seems like it's ping-ponged between a lot of different versions of John Schneider over the years.
Yes.
Based on, like, we've seen him be aggressive. We've seen him be a little bit somebody who holds back a little bit, somebody who trades down, somebody who accumulates picks. And there's also the problem of we don't really know how much was John and how much was Pete, right? In terms of what kind of players they were seeking out and why. So I think there are also a lot of complicating factors here that make it difficult to understand exactly how much
there weren't
of
a
this
lot
is John
of head
Schneider.
coaches. There weren't a lot of head coaches out there that were also president of football operations.
Yes, you count them on one hand. And so I think that's also part of this, is that we're just seeing what John's tenure looks like when he's at the helm, and that has been uneven. The free agent class that they had last year on defense, not great. Did not do so well.
They signed 10 free agents last year, and none of them will be on the roster in 2025.
Which is wild. And I think that's
0 for 10.
you have a coach come in middle of January. You've got a couple months before you figure out what type of players they want.
Yes.
And I think that they corrected themselves a little bit. You go out and you trade for Ernest Jones. That kind of absolves some of the sins of what you try to do at linebacker and free agency. I think they've gotten a much better sense of what kind of defense they want to be, what sort of players they want to seek out. But it's always going to be a process. And I think that we're watching that process play out in real time. The same thing goes with the offensive approach, right? I think that they realized pretty quickly, this was not the way that we should have done this. This has been something in terms of the structure of the offense that's made the players individually look worse. We need to try to correct this. And I think in a way, by going out and getting a Clint Kubiak, they overcorrected a little bit in a way that makes sense, but I can understand why that's the place that they would land.
Yeah. Well, let's talk specifics. On top end, we're looking at like the needle moving, and I want to mention this because I have been really hard on John Schneider this offseason so far, with the caveat, of course, that there's more dominoes to fall. We'll see how it plays out. I've also been a pretty staunch John Schneider defender for the decade prior. And so this isn't some axe that I finally get to grind. I really try to keep my opinions fluid enough that if there's compelling evidence to the contrary, I'm open to it and I'm open to pivoting. And I have not loved this offseason, but I'm close to it, right? As my friend Craig Horlbeck from The Ringer says, sometimes you're too far inside the bottle to be able to read the label. So you're outside looking at the bottle. You went from Geno Smith, DK Metcalf, essentially to Sam Darnold and Cooper Kupp, right? And then with those trades, you freed up some money. You got some draft picks. Did Seattle get enough back in those moves to take them further than where you think they would have gone without making those moves?
Maybe not in 2025, but I guess that should be the question. Is that what's most important? Or is the overall outlook and health of the roster over the next 2 to 3 years more important? The way that I look at this is how I felt about it since December when I first brought this up. I am okay and I support the DK Metcalf trade. I think that getting $30 million in flexibility plus the 52nd overall pick in the draft for DK Metcalf, that is a trade that I would make pretty much every single time because I think DK Metcalf has limitations. I think the idea of what he is more compelling than what he actually is. And if you can get that sort of haul for him and reallocate some of those resources, that's fine with me. I think Geno's really good. And when I looked at what that offense looked like last year, again, you bring in Clint Kubiak, you are structurally changing so much about what your offense is going to be. Last year, you were one of the least play action heavy teams in the league, one of the least under center teams in the league. You ran an offensive system that was designed in part to hang your offensive lineman out to dry and put more on your quarterback that is reasonable to ask of a quarterback in 2024 when you look at offenses around the league. By going out and getting Clint Kubiak, you were taking a sharp left turn away from that to now a system that hopefully will put less on your quarterback, less on your offensive lineman. I would have preferred to just see Geno in that environment and make the DK trade than do both of them in the way that they did. That's where I would personally have landed.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Full disclosure, this isn't new to anyone listening. DK Metcalf, he's my favorite player. And so selfishly would love to continue to see him in a Seahawks uniform. You actually articulated this really beautifully on Twitter yesterday, talking about how the math really adds up, especially if they're able to sign like a Tevin Jenkins. And I think at the time you had said Mekhi Becton, who has since found a landing spot. There is a way that Seattle come where the sum of the return is greater than where the whole of the return is greater than the sum of its parts. Because for as awesome as I think DK Metcalf is, and for how misused I think he's been by both Shane Waldron and Ryan Grubb, he's not a perfect player by any stretch. He just does a few things really, really well. And the best version of DK Metcalf is in an offense that puts him in those positions to succeed. And I don't think Seattle did that, but I am okay, especially after seeing the contract that he signed with Pittsburgh. I've made my peace with, I'm okay with that move. I struggle with the Geno Smith one. And you and Derek had an awesome conversation in one of your recent shows, kind of debating about whether you thought the Seahawks were really in a position to push beyond that 10-win ceiling that they've been bumping their heads against for a while. And Derek really felt like with Geno Smith doing some of these other moves, Mike McDonald's defense, you really could push forward. And you were a little bit more tempered on that, and I appreciated it. I think the challenge for me is I've always been okay with moving on from Geno Smith if you've got a really compelling reason to do so. And a pressure-sensitive quarterback in Sam Darnold does not, to me, present itself as a compelling alternative to Geno Smith, even with the age savings and the salary savings. Now, since it's come out that they could get out of it after a year, free and clear, if there's no major injury, that's helpful. It keeps you flexible. So maybe it ends up working out. But it does feel like a step back at the position to me.
I think that's totally fair. And I don't disagree with that at all. I just think I'm open to the timeline where they're close enough that the 7 years in age, the $10 million in salary, and the future, then potential flexibility is worth it. I think that's kind of what I meant when I was talking about the humility that comes with this sort of offseason, where it's like, you know what? I'm not sure that Geno's any better than Sam Darnold. So why wouldn't I just take the cheaper quarterback plus the pick that's 7 years younger? I don't believe that, but I can understand landing in that place. And if you go listen to that conversation I had with Derek, I think it's me playing devil's advocate more than anything. There have been very few people who have been more staunch Geno supporters than me. I just think that I'm open to the idea that they'll be close enough in terms of production, him and Sam, that some of the other downstream benefits from the trade ultimately tilt it in your favor to go the direction that they did. I don't necessarily think that's a guarantee because I do think Geno's really good, but I understand the vision and the motivation behind it.
Well, and you know, if I were to mount a defense for John Schneider with this move, his track record for landing the plane at quarterback has been pretty damn good, right? He came in and his first big move was Matt Flynn. And when the evidence said Russell Wilson is better, he didn't, him and Pete did not hesitate to make Russell Wilson the opening day starter, to the consternation of a lot of people in that locker room at the time. And
I'll tell you a quick story.
Please do.
I'll tell you a quick story. It was the summer of 2012, and I was 24 years old, and I was working at Grantland, and they had this event at the Nike campus in Oregon called The Opening, and it was a high school event, but they had some like NFL players there. I can't remember exactly why, but Russell Wilson was there. And he had just been drafted in the 3rd round. And even then, he was doing like Russell Wilson stuff on the field that day. Like it was him alone, and he was like going through all these drills. And I'm sitting there being like, oh man, he's really working hard to sit behind Matt Flynn this year. And then the year plays out the way that it did. And I just remember me like making fun of Russell Wilson in that moment and just thinking, man, you're a moron. Like you are just, you know way less than you think you do. So that, from the locker room and from outside the locker room, I think there were some real questions about Russell Wilson's viability for the 2012 Seahawks.
Nope. And he justified the faith that was put in him. And then after that, I mean, we can point to a lot of 1st round trades that John Schneider missed on, but I don't know that anyone has ever sold higher and gotten the best return for a player than he did with the Russell Wilson trade. Now, the fact that 3 years later, the Broncos are in a better situation than the Seahawks are maybe speaks a little bit to John Schneider also. But he, and I've said this on the show half a dozen times at least, but I remember after the trade and the big debate was the starting quarterback going to be Geno Smith or Drew Lock. And I said it didn't matter because whoever it is going to be gone after this year. And Geno delivered, right? So he has had continuity at the quarterback position in a way that 90% of NFL teams would dream of over a 15-year stretch. So he has earned some benefit of the doubt that maybe this is the right pivot. This felt like the wrong year to pivot off of Geno Smith, given how bleak the quarterback landscape is. But the fact that it could be a 1-year deal, you get the agent numbers, 3 years, $100 million. Well, if Sam Darnold makes $100 million for the Seahawks, it's because he's been kicking some fucking ass. Because they kept him for 3 years and were willing to pay him all those escalators. So I think there is some benefit of the doubt to be put there. And if it doesn't work out, and I'm very, very hesitant to believe that it will, they're in a position next year to reanalyze, revisit, and they're going to have increased salary cap flexibility. And if it fails this year, they'll probably have pretty good draft picks. So there is a way that it works out. I want to get your feelings real quick on a couple of other signings. DeMarcus Lawrence, Cooper Kupp, are they fits? They feel a little bit like win now moves, both being on north side of 30. The Geno Smith and DK Metcalf trades did not feel like win now. To your point, the way that it works is beyond 2025, but Kupp and Lawrence feel like 2025 moves. What is your reaction to those acquisitions?
I just love that Mike McDonald's just sitting there collecting edge rushers. He's like, yeah, could we use one more? We could use one more. I think that's a fine place to land. Right. And I think that's fine.
Little Danny Ocean.
Yeah. I think that's definitely the tone of that when they've looked at defensive linemen over the last couple of years. I mean, even the Byron Murphy pick in the first round is like that. It's like, yeah, we probably need one more of those guys. So the fact that Mike is well equipped in those spots is very funny. I think that I agree with you in some ways in that I think that the Geno move and the Sam Darnold move feel like future move. Or the Geno move and the DK trade feel like future moves. But if they get a guy like Tevin Jenkins, and that math that you do is Cooper Kupp, Tevin Jenkins, and MVS for the DK money, I don't necessarily think that is a future move. You just kind of got the second round pick on top of that. And that's why I think that it's a good return on the DK trade. And again, there's a chance that Sam Darnold is as good as Geno Smith is this year. I don't think this is like a reset. And so in their minds. And so that's why I don't necessarily think that the Cooper Kupp signing and the DeMarcus Lawrence signing are incongruous with what they want to accomplish this year. Because I think in their minds, they're trying to be just as good as they were last year, and the Sam Darnold thing isn't a step down from Geno Smith. We can disagree about that, and I think I probably would. But I think that's the mindset that they're taking to this.
Yeah. And, we still haven't seen the Cooper Kupp guaranteed numbers yet. At least I haven't. So once we peek under the hood, I'm assuming it's not a ton of guaranteed money. Because typically, if it is a ton of guaranteed money, the agents put that in their text to
Ian Rappaport
and Adam Schefter and Tom Pelissero, right? Right away how much guaranteed money they got. So I'm guessing it's not really $45 million or probably anything close to it. Last thing I'll say about the individual moves is a question for you. Do you have any pause with the fact that Cooper Kupp, who was so productive and so much a part of the identity of the Sean McVay offense for a number of years, was like, as soon as the season ended, the Rams were like, we want to thank Cooper Kupp for his service and we wish him well. And Cooper Kupp's like, what the fuck? What do you mean? And then it's not like, well, hey, we want to get younger at the position. It's like, no, actually, we're just going to take that money and give it to someone the same age as you in Devontae Adams. Does that give you any pause at all?
I think that's a sign of a couple different things. One, Sean is ruthless when he wants to be. And I think we've seen that a few different times with that team where they're just willing to say, you know what, thank you, but we're good. We're going to move in a different direction. I will say this. If I were trying to serve some cope to Seahawks fans about why this would happen, I think that Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp are sort of redundant in what they're going to provide in offense. So if you can spend the Cooper Kupp money on Devontae Adams, who is a very different sort of player, and I think in a lot of ways the exact player they needed for that offense, that makes some sense. That being said, I think Jacson, Smith-Njigba, and Cooper Kupp are also a little bit redundant. So I'm not exactly sure that was the right allocation. If you were going to allocate the DK money, Cooper Kupp is a surprising place to do it for me. There weren't a lot of other receivers available, right? I mean, that's just the nature of this free agent core or free agent crop. But that's also a problem in Seattle, I think, when I look at it at first glance, is like, how are these two guys going to fit together?
Well, especially in a Kubiak offense that does a ton of 12 personnel where there's only two wide receivers on the field. And so it's like, it's not even like there's a slot spot necessarily available in the formation half the time. And these are now, I don't want to paint. We're not talking about Wan'Dale Robinson here with either of these guys. This is not Rondale Moore here. They have both shown the ability to win on the outside, but their metrics are so much better, both of them, when they're in the slot. And I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of slot receiver snaps out there. And you have two primarily slot receivers as your top two guys. I just wonder if Seattle wouldn't have had a more complementary fit by doing what the Rams did in going for Devontae as opposed to Cooper Kupp. But I suppose we will see.
That might have been the case, but I think it would have been hard to do that before you knew whether the DK trade was going to be consummated, right? And so I think that might be one of the issues there. I will say, I think that by playing more condensed formations, and even if you're in 12 personnel, if those guys are hugging a little bit closer to the formation, then there's a little bit less concern about them operating outside or from the slot because they're kind of splitting the difference. And so being in 12 personnel and just having things be a little bit more condensed, I think that you could theoretically be putting those guys in positions to succeed, even if they are better as slot players.
Well, and to your point, you know, when you have a wide zone running scheme, which one I think is going to be a boon for Ken Walker's skill set, you're also putting, you know, you've got a more horizontally stretched offense, whereas last year Seattle was like they kind of either ran up the middle or they didn't run at all. And the types of play action that you can do off of running on the perimeter does create more space for wide receivers because you are forcing defenders, linebackers, and safeties who have their eyes on the quarterback to cover more horizontally as a result, which creates more space. So maybe that's how it ends up working. That being said, there are still holes on this roster. There's holes on most NFL teams' rosters this time of year, but Seattle has some obvious ones. Last question I have for you. Are there specific players? Because positions is easy. Are there specific players in this draft that you're looking at that you're like, you know what? I'm kind of circling that guy if I'm Seattle.
That will start for me in earnest this week. Okay. Now that we have turned the page past free agency, I did a show with Dane Brugler today, and so we're literally digging into the draft pool starting next week. I can do positions, though.
Let's do positions.
And I will say, I think that if they go out and they get, let's say it's Tevin Jenkins, right? Like they sign a starting guard in free agency. Name your starting guard.
Sure.
I think that a combination of that plus one guy with that second or third round pick in the interior of the offensive line and saying, all right, because we think the ecosystem is going to be better this year, we're comfortable rolling into camp with Charles Cross, Tevin Jenkins, Olu, some combination of Christian Haynes, the guy they drafted in the 6th round, whose name I can never remember, and whoever they're drafting in the 3rd round. That's going to be a competition. And then Abe Lucas, you know, it was an adventure early on last year, but I think eventually he found his footing a little bit. Mm-hmm. If that's the group we're rolling with, and we're betting on how much the offense is going to lift that group in a way it couldn't last year, I think that's justifiable. And then I would like to see them do something that's a long-term answer at receiver, right? Mm-hmm. Can they go get some sort of vertical presence that can be more of an outside option that is not Marquez Valdez-Scantling? Sure. And if they can do that, let's say it's even in the 1st round, like let's say at you know, wherever it's 17 or wherever they're picking, there's a Matthew Golden or somebody like that available. And then you find an interior offensive lineman somewhere along the way. That's a plan I can get behind personnel wise. Whether or not it all comes together and whether or not Sam Darnold melts when you throw a little bit of pressure on him, that's a different conversation. But I think from a team building perspective, there are paths there for it to work out.
Let's say that at pick 18, and they're not trading out of it, they're not moving up or down, there are the following 4 players available. They've made their mind up. We're going to use this first pick on a pass-catching option. And the 4 players that are available to you are Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland, Matthew Golden, and Emeka Egbuka. Would you value in a Clint Kubiak system more of that dual threat tight end or a boundary receiver?
based on what I understand, my understanding is that Warren maybe is a little bit more of a dual threat tight end than a guy like Loveland is, who's more of a receiving option. I don't know where I sit with these receiving tight ends, these receiving only tight ends. It's actually something another thing I want to talk about as we get to draft season. I was talking to Dane today, and we were talking about Loveland and how, like you could just use him as a receiver if you want to. We say that all the time. I don't know how often that actually works out. Like, I think for me, the Dalton Kincaid thing is scarring me a little bit. And there was a good year of production from Sam Laporta, but how often is this working out in situations where it's not Travis Kelce? I think is something that I actually want to study. I'm open to either direction, but I think that the idea of, our best receiver can just be a tight end, it's the same as a receiver, I don't know how true that is. So I think unless it's a dual threat tight end where you are comfortable playing that guy in line and he is capable of adding something as a blocker, in a vacuum, I think I'd probably rather have the boundary receiver.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of George Kittles on this planet, turns out.
Yeah, not a lot of those guys walking through the door. So I think, we'll see how long Fant's even on the roster, but theoretically they do have what you would call a pass catching tight end, and they do not have a perimeter receiver as things currently stand.
Yep. I tend to lean that way. If Warren's there, I'm having a hard time moving off of him, but if it's not, I think you need someone that can either be immediately or grow into quickly more of that traditional X receiver, because it just opens up. When you have a guy that wins on the perimeter, it opens up so much for your offense. It's not just what that receiver does with their own personal production. It's what it does for the rest of the offense. Listen, Robert, man, this has been so awesome. I am super grateful for your time. I have really, really enjoyed this conversation.
I'm very happy to have done it. I really appreciate you asking me, and let's do it again sometime.
I would love that. Listen, before you go, tell anyone who may not know already where they can find more of you.
The Athletic Football Show is available wherever you get your podcasts. We're still doing, let's call it 4 episodes a week, all off season. So that's kind of what we're rolling with. Me and Derek Klassen multiple times a week. Like I mentioned, Dane Brugler, who's our draft expert at The Athletic, he's going to be back in the fold now that we're in the lead up to draft season. I really don't think anybody does this better than Dane when it comes to draft coverage. And so if you guys are looking for a draft specific podcast here in the next 6 weeks or so before the draft gets going, highly encourage you guys to come check out those conversations with Dane.
Yeah, please do. And look, if you're watching this show by now, it's not to confirm your priors. So if you want to be a smarter football fan, make sure you are listening to the Athletic Football Show with Robert and Derek. Again, man, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Happy to do it. Thanks, man.
Once again, a huge shout out to Robert Mays from The Athletic for his time today. As always, you can find Mike and I on social media. I am on Twitter and Blue Sky at Jacson Bevins. That's Jacson. Remember that no K is okay when spelling my name. Mike is on both at Mike Barwin, and the show itself is at Cigar Thoughts on Twitter and at CigarThoughtsNFL.com on Blue Sky. You can catch full video episodes on our YouTube channel at Cigar Thoughts. Find the rest of our socials at CigarThoughtsNFL.com. As mentioned previously, this episode is brought to you by Balvenie Premium Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. Y'all know how much I like their stuff. We are thrilled to have them on board as a sponsor of the show. And look, great scotch goes with a great cigar. So get the Cigar Thoughts Stogies at CigarThoughtsNFL.com, or just follow the link on the show page, or you can reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram, or Blue Sky, whatever, like a lot of you have done, and I'll send you the details there as well. So great opportunity for you if you like cigars, or if you're curious about cigars, or if you have someone in your life that loves them. Pretty cool opportunity to get a very, very high-end quality cigar for an affordable price. Of course, you can listen to this show at fieldgoals.com and everywhere you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you like the show, drop us a 5-star rating and leave us a quick review. Can't tell you how much that means to both Mike and I. Lets us know what we're doing well, and we want to continue to make this show better for you guys. I want to thank all of y'all listening for your continued support of this show. We know you've only got so much time for podcasts in your life, and it is an honor to be a part of that for y'all. Please know that by sharing this show on social media and with your friends, give us the juice to keep making it happen. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, onwards and upwards, my friends.